In this video, we're going to take a look at the signal path and layout of the Mother-32. So this is a default setting. It's generally a good place to start when making a sound as it's fairly neutral. It doesn't have any modulation or sound coloring from the filter, and I'll explain why I like these settings as a starting point as a go. If you're playing along, you might want to make sure that everything looks just like this. So let's start to make sense of the layout. As I said in the intro, one of the main reasons that people get semi-modular synths as opposed to going all in on a modular system is that the basic synth voice is already hardwired for you. In some respects, the Mother-32 is the same as a modular system that contains an oscillator, an envelope generator, a filter, noise generator, LFO, and a voltage controlled amplifier. It's kind of like those 6 modules all wrapped into one with a few other utilities like multipliers and attenuator. Not to mention the built-in sequencer. So it's a pretty cost-effective way of experiencing modular synthesis. And also because it's hardwired, you don't have to do the basic patching of a synth voice as it's already done for you. Furthermore, many of these hardwired connections can be modified or overridden using the patch bay. So I'm going to explain each of those sections in more depth in their own videos. Right now, I'm just covering the layout and how everything is connected together. But I think it does help to think of the Mother as individual modules. That way you can see how this might be a gateway to modular, but it also helps to come up with creative ways to use it down the road. So let's start up here. Here we can find our sound sources. The Mother has one oscillator and one noise generator. The VCO, the oscillator, can be tuned using this frequency knob. It has 2 waveforms, a sawtooth and a pulse wave or square wave, and you can change them here using this switch. The noise generator is hidden. You can't really see it or adjust it, but you can adjust the mix between the oscillator sound waves and the noise with this mix knob. This knob changes the shape of the pulse wave. It doesn't have any impact on the sound of the saw wave. So when it's set to saw, this doesn't do anything. But we'll take a closer look at this with an oscilloscope in the oscillator video. So we color and shape our sounds using the filter, which is controlled by these 2 knobs. There's a cutoff, which controls the frequency of the cutoff, and resonance. And we can select between high and low pass filters using this switch, the VCF mode. These last 2 controls are for the VCA, the voltage controlled amplifier. This switch tells the amplifier whether or not it should bypass the envelope generator. In layman's terms, that means that if you turn it on, sound's going to drone on constantly. But what it's really doing is just engaging or bypassing the envelope. For most purposes, you're going to want to leave this in the down position on EG. And this knob obviously controls the volume level or the output of the sound. Now the second row of knobs and switches is kind of interesting. These 3 are modulation controls for the oscillator. These 3 are modulation controls for the filter. We have the filter mode in the middle, which we already talked about, and then our glide over here. The glide knob controls how much smoothing there is between notes of the sequencer. I kind of think of this as a part of the sequencer, but that's up for debate. Either way, it's good to know that these 3 knobs control the modulation for the oscillator. These 3 knobs control the modulation for the filter. And we'll talk more about those later. Both of these have a switch that controls where the modulation comes from, either the envelope or the VCO mod, or the LFO on the bottom. The knobs control how much that modulation is impacting the sound. This switch controls where the oscillation modulation goes, to pulse width or its frequency, and this switch controls the polarity of the filter modulation. We're going to talk about all of this in a separate video. So our modulation sources are on the bottom row. There's our LFO, which can have 2 different waves selectable by this switch, and the rate is controlled by this switch. And then we have our envelope over here. It has a rise or attack phase, a decay phase, and in the middle, we have the sustain. I'll talk in more detail about that too and when to turn this on and off. But this is controlling whether or not there's a sustain phase on the envelope. This envelope could be attached to the filter if you select EG here. This VC mix is voltage controlled mix. It's a way to manipulate control voltages, and you can use the patch bay, and it's connected to certain patches in the patch bay. So we're not going to need that until we get into the patch bay. And lastly, we have our sequencer, transport controls. Tempo obviously controls the internal clock of the sequencer. The glide controls the slur or slew between notes of the sequencer. And finally, on our right, we have the patch bay. And this is where we can modify many of the internal connections and just make really cool stuff. Here's an image of the signal flow from the manual. As you can see, the sound sources of the VCO and noise are fed into the mixer. The sound then travels to the filter where it's shaped and colored, and then it goes to the amplifier. And that's where the sound comes out of the synth. Our two modulation sources, the LFO and envelope, can modulate the filter and VCO. And as you can see here from the dotted lines, the sequencer and keyboard can control the VCO and the envelope. And we can use the patch bay to bypass noise and put in external signals here. And if you want to visualize that on the front end, we have our oscillators, which is the sound comes out of the oscillators and it's colored by the filter, which is modulated here and controlled by the envelope, comes out of the VCA and into our speakers. That's a general overview of the interface of the Mother and the signal flow. We're going to dive much more in depth to each of those sections in the videos. The next video, we're going to take a look at the oscillator section. So I hope you got something out of this and that you're excited about it. I'm certainly excited to talk all about the Mother. Make sure you subscribe so you know when I release a video, and I'll see you next time.